Mia Khalifa walked down a busy street, her dark sunglasses shielding her from the occasional glance of recognition. She wasn't in the mood to be noticed today. With her coat wrapped tightly around her, she clutched her phone, scrolling absent-mindedly, trying to keep her thoughts occupied. Just as she was about to cross an intersection, a voice cut through the noise. "Miss, could you spare $1?" Mia barely turned her head. The voice had the weary tone of someone who had asked the same question too many times before. She paused, glancing toward the man who had spoken. He stood near a lamppost, wearing a tattered hoodie and jeans that had long since lost their shape. His face was lined with exhaustion, his beard unkempt, but his eyes were sharp, as if they carried stories no one had asked to hear. Mia hesitated. She had encountered homeless people before, and like most people, she had developed an automatic response, either giving them something without much thought or simply walking away. But something about this man made her linger for just a second longer. "Why just $1?" she asked, her tone not unfriendly, but skeptical. The man smiled, a slight, almost amused grin. "Because that's all I need right now." Mia arched an eyebrow. It wasn't the usual plea for food or shelter. His answer felt calculated, as if he had chosen those words carefully. "And what would you do with it?" she continued, feeling an odd curiosity creeping in. The man's smile didn't fade. "I could tell you, but that wouldn't be nearly as interesting as you figuring it out for yourself." She let out a soft breath, shaking her head slightly. Clever. If he was playing a game, he was good at it. For a brief moment, she considered just giving him the money and walking away. But something in his gaze held her there. It wasn't desperation. It wasn't even neediness. It was recognition. "I know you," the man said suddenly, his voice lower now, more deliberate. Mia's spine stiffened. She had heard that sentence before, from strangers, from people who had seen her online, in interviews, in passing conversations. But this was different. The way he said it wasn't with excitement or curiosity. It was as if he was stating a fact, one that carried weight. She folded her arms, her voice measured. "You know me." The man nodded, his expression unreadable. "Yeah. And I think you know me too." Something cold trickled down her spine. She didn't recognize him. At least, she didn't think she did. But the certainty in his voice was unsettling. Before she could respond, the pedestrian light turned green, and the people around her began moving again. For a second, she thought about just walking away. But then, against her better judgment, she stayed. "How?" she asked, her voice quieter now. The man's eyes seemed to flicker with something, understanding, maybe even amusement. "You're asking the right question," he said. "But I wonder, are you ready for the answer?" Mia's pulse quickened, though she wasn't sure why. The way the man spoke, it wasn't desperate, it wasn't pleading. It was knowing. That was what unsettled her. She studied him for a moment, trying to place his face, his voice, anything that might explain why he was looking at her like he had just run into an old friend. But nothing came to mind. "You think I know you?" she asked, skeptical. The man gave a slow nod. "I don't think. I know." Mia let out a soft breath, crossing her arms. She had been recognized in the strangest places before, but this was different. This wasn't some casual, "Hey, aren't you?" It was something deeper. "All right," she said, shifting her weight onto one foot. "Then who are you?" The man tilted his head slightly, as if considering how to answer. His lips parted, but instead of giving her a name, he said something else entirely. "You were wearing a red dress that night." Mia's body tensed. It wasn't just the words, it was the way he said them. The certainty. The precision. The way his eyes didn't waver, didn't seek approval or validation. He wasn't guessing. He knew. A sharp gust of wind blew between them, rattling the street signs. Mia swallowed, forcing her voice to stay steady. "What night?" Now, the man smiled again, just a small, knowing curve of his lips. "You remember." She didn't. Or, at least, she didn't think she did. But now, her mind was searching, flipping through old memories like pages of a book she hadn't opened in years. A red dress. That should have been vague. She had worn red dresses before, many times. But something about the way he said it, it felt specific. It felt real. Mia's fingers curled slightly. "If you know me, then say my name." The man exhaled, glancing down for a moment as if considering whether he should. And then, "Mia," he said simply. "But that's not the name I knew you by." Her breath caught. She didn't move. She didn't blink. A slow chill crept up her arms. She had changed her name years ago. Before everything. The sounds of the street around them felt distant now, like background noise in a movie where the focus had narrowed onto just two characters. "How do you know that name?" she asked, her voice quieter now, the confidence from before fading just slightly. The man's expression softened. He wasn't taunting her. He wasn't trying to unsettle her. "Because," he said, "you and we were there that night. At the same place. When everything changed." Mia felt her pulse in her ears. There was only one night she could think of. One night where her past had collided with the future she hadn't even seen coming. A night that had set her on a path she never expected. But this man, he had been there. "That's impossible," she whispered. The man shrugged, as if to say, maybe. Maybe not. "You were laughing," he continued, his voice almost distant, like he was remembering something he hadn't thought about in years. "You were with someone who meant a lot to you. And then, before the night was over, something happened." Mia felt frozen. How did he know this? Her hands tightened into fists at her sides. This wasn't some coincidence. This wasn't just another stranger recognizing her. He had been there. And if that was true, then what else did he know? Mia exhaled slowly, forcing her heartbeat to slow. "Who are you?" she asked again, her voice lower now. The man held her gaze for a long moment before answering. "A man who lost everything," he said. "And I think, in some way, you did too." Mia's stomach turned. Because for the first time since the conversation started, she realized something that unsettled her even more than his words. She wasn't just curious anymore. She was afraid. Mia's mind raced. She searched the man's face again, desperately trying to place him in her memory, but nothing surfaced. And yet, the way he spoke, so sure, so calm, made her stomach twist. "I don't believe you," she said, though her voice lacked conviction. The man exhaled softly, rubbing his hands together for warmth. "I wouldn't expect you to. Not yet." She wanted to walk away. She should have. But she didn't. Something about this conversation had rooted her to the pavement, refusing to let her leave. "Tell me what happened," she demanded. The man studied her for a moment, then glanced down at the ground, as if choosing his words carefully. "It was years ago," he began, his voice steady. "A party. Not just any party, an exclusive one. You weren't famous yet. Not the way you are now. You were just starting to figure things out. Testing the waters. Trying to decide who you were going to be." Mia's breath hitched. She knew exactly which night he was talking about. The red dress. The unfamiliar faces. The music so loud it felt like it was inside her chest. She had been younger then, more reckless. At the time, she thought it was just another night out, another opportunity to step further into a world she wasn't sure she wanted to be part of. And yet, as the memory surfaced, so did something else, something she had long buried. "You were there?" she asked, her voice quieter now. The man nodded. "Not as a guest," he admitted. "I was working. I had a different life back then, one with a suit, a title, a future. That night was supposed to be just another transaction. Just another deal in a string of many. But something happened." Mia's pulse pounded in her ears. "Something happened," she repeated, feeling the weight of his words. The man looked up at her, his eyes reflecting something deeper than regret, something closer to grief. "A decision was made that night," he continued. "By me. By you. By a lot of people. And it changed everything." Mia swallowed hard. She had made choices that night. Some she had been proud of, others she had spent years trying to forget. But the idea that this man, this stranger, had also been affected by that night, that shook her. "What decision?" she asked, though she wasn't sure she wanted the answer. The man exhaled sharply, shaking his head. "It's not that simple," he said. "It wasn't one moment. It was a series of them. Small things that seemed meaningless at the time but ended up rewriting our lives. Mia clenched her jaw. She didn't like games. Then tell me one, she challenged. The man hesitated for only a second. Then, his eyes locked onto hers. I was offered a choice, he said. Stay on the path I was on, or take the money and walk away. Mia's stomach clenched. She remembered that night. She remembered whispers of deals being made behind closed doors. People she had just met disappearing into rooms and coming out looking different, lighter or heavier, depending on what they had left behind. You left, she guessed. The man let out a dry chuckle. Not exactly. Mia narrowed her eyes. Then what? He hesitated. I took the money, he admitted. But I didn't walk away. I made the wrong choice, Mia. And it cost me everything. She stared at him, her mind reeling. You're saying that one night ruined your life? She asked, skeptical. The man shook his head. Not just one night. One choice. One moment where I thought I was doing the right thing, and I wasn't. Mia's chest tightened. She had made choices that night too. Some she regretted. Some had set her on the path she was on now. And now, standing in front of this man who claimed to have lost everything, she couldn't help but wonder. Had she made the wrong choice too? Mia's skin prickled with unease. The man's words lingered in her mind, each one pressing against something she had long tried to forget. She didn't want to believe him. Couldn't. And yet, something about his story felt too familiar to dismiss. You think one decision destroyed your life? She asked, her voice steady despite the churn of emotions inside her. The man exhaled, his breath visible in the cool air. It wasn't just my life, he said. It changed yours too. You just don't see it yet. Mia clenched her jaw. And what exactly do you think I lost? The man gave her a look, not pitying, not accusing. Just knowing. You had a choice that night too, he said. I remember watching you. You didn't belong there, not really. But you stayed. And before the night was over, you weren't the same person who walked in. Mia felt her stomach tighten. She wanted to argue, to deny it. But the worst part, he was right. She had made a choice that night. And she had spent years trying to convince herself it had been the right one. The memory was distant at first, blurred by time and self-preservation. But now, with this stranger standing in front of her, peeling back the layers of a past she had buried, the images came rushing back. The dimly lit room. The unfamiliar faces. The drinks. The laughter that didn't quite reach her eyes. And then, the moment. A man, someone she barely knew, had leaned in, whispered something in her ear. A proposition, a fork in the road. One path led to comfort, security, and a world of new opportunities. The other, uncertainty. Walking away. She had chosen to stay. And that night had set everything in motion. Mia swallowed hard, forcing herself back to the present. You were part of it, she said, her voice quieter now. That deal. That whole thing. The man nodded slowly. I was in deeper than you, he admitted. I had more to lose. And I lost it all. Mia's breath came faster now, her mind trying to piece everything together. Who were you? She asked. Before all this. The man hesitated, then finally spoke. A name won't mean much to you, he said. Not anymore. But back then. I was the kind of man who never had to ask for $1 on the street. His eyes darkened. I had a career. Power. I was connected to people who controlled things most wouldn't even believe. He looked away for a moment, then met her gaze again. And I was at that party because I thought I was untouchable. I thought I was making a move that would put me ahead of the game. Mia felt a chill crawl up her spine. What happened? She asked, though she wasn't sure she wanted the answer. The man's jaw tightened. I made a deal that should have never been made, he said. And the moment I shook hands with the wrong person, my fate was sealed. Mia exhaled sharply. And you think I did the same? The man studied her. Not exactly, he said. You made a different choice. But that doesn't mean it didn't cost you something. Mia shook her head, as if trying to clear the thoughts swirling inside her. "I don't regret my choices," she said, more to convince herself than him. "Maybe not," the man said. "Not yet." The words hit harder than she expected. Mia stepped back, crossing her arms. "Why tell me this now?" she asked. "Why approach me, ask for $1, and then drop this on me?" The man took a breath, his expression unreadable. "Because you were the last person who saw me before my life fell apart," he said. "And after all these years, I had to know if you ever looked back." Mia felt the weight of his words settle in her chest. Had she? She had moved forward, pushed through, built a life. But now, standing here, face to face with a past she hadn't even realized was unfinished, she wasn't sure anymore. She glanced down at the crumpled dollar bill in her hand. The man hadn't taken it. Hadn't even reached for it. Because, she realized now, he had never really been asking for money. He had been asking for something else entirely. A reckoning. A recognition. And now, she had to decide, was she willing to give him that? Mia's grip on the crumpled dollar tightened. The weight of the conversation pressed against her chest like a stone, heavy and unmoving. She had spent years moving forward, never once allowing herself to look back. And now, this man, this ghost from a forgotten night, had pulled her into a past she wasn't prepared to face. She exhaled slowly, steadying herself. "You think I owe you something?" she asked, voice quieter now. The man didn't answer right away. Instead, he studied her, his sharp eyes searching her face as if trying to see whether she truly didn't remember, or if she was just refusing to. "Not oh," he said finally. "But I think we both left that night with unfinished business." Mia hated how those words made her stomach twist. She had been young, ambitious, standing at a crossroads she hadn't fully understood. That night had been the turning point. It had set everything in motion, the career, the fame, the identity she had built. But for him, it had been the moment his world fell apart. "You said I was the last person to see you before your life changed," she said, forcing herself to hold his gaze. "What did I do?" The man let out a breath that sounded like a mix of frustration and exhaustion. "It wasn't what you did," he said. "It was what you saw." Mia frowned. "What I saw?" The man nodded. "That night, you saw something you weren't supposed to. Something I wasn't supposed to let happen. And because of that, they made me disappear." A chill ran down her spine. "They," she echoed. He didn't answer right away. Instead, his gaze flickered to the moving city around them, as if making sure no one else was listening. "People who don't like loose ends," he said finally. "People who decide who gets to stay in the game, and who gets erased." Mia felt her throat tighten. She had been young, but she hadn't been naive. She had seen things that night that had never quite sat right with her, whispers of power plays and invisible hands pulling strings behind the scenes. But she had never thought about what happened after she walked away. "You think I was part of it?" she asked, a strange mix of guilt and defensiveness creeping into her voice. The man shook his head. "No," he said. "I think you were just in the wrong place at the wrong time. But that didn't stop them from making sure I took the fall." Mia swallowed hard. "And now you want... what?" "Revenge." For the first time since the conversation started, the man smiled, just a small, tired smile, more bitter than amused. "If I wanted revenge, I wouldn't be standing here talking to you," he said. "I just wanted to know if you ever wondered what happened to me. If you ever thought about that night after you walked away." Mia opened her mouth, then hesitated. Had she? She had tucked the memory away, filed it under "a night that changed everything," but never stopped to ask what it had changed for anyone else. And now, standing face to face with the answer, she didn't know how to feel. She glanced down at the dollar bill in her hand. It felt ridiculous now, how small and insignificant it was compared to everything they had just dredged up. Slowly, she reached out, pressing it into his hand. The man looked at it, then back at her. "That's not why I stopped you," he said. "I know," Mia admitted. And yet, somehow, it felt important anyway. The man tucked the bill into his pocket, then nodded. "Then I guess that's it," he said. "Take care of yourself, Mia." He turned, ready to walk away. And for the first time since the conversation started, Mia felt something she hadn't expected. She didn't want him to go. Mia stood frozen, watching as the man turned away. His steps were slow, deliberate, as if he had already accepted that this was how their conversation would end. But something inside her, something she couldn't quite name, refused to let it. "Wait," she called. The man stopped but didn't turn around right away. He let the word linger in the air, as if waiting to see if she would take it back. When she didn't, he finally glanced over his shoulder. Mia didn't know what she was doing. Everything in her life had been built on forward momentum. Keep going, keep moving, don't look back. And yet, here she was, doing the very thing she had spent years avoiding. "I don't understand," she said, her voice steadier now. "Why now? Why come back after all these years, just to tell me this?" The man exhaled, his breath visible in the cold air. "Because I needed to know if I was the only one who remembered," he said simply. Mia felt something tighten in her chest. "You're not," she admitted. The words felt heavier than she expected. The man studied her, his expression unreadable. "Then why did you never try to find out what happened?" Mia hesitated. She could have lied. She could have said that she hadn't thought about it, that she had been too busy, that life had moved on. But the truth was that she had thought about that night. More times than she cared to admit. She had wondered what had happened after she left. Had wondered if the people she met had gone on to live their lives as if nothing had changed, or if some of them, like this man, had been swallowed whole by the choices they had made. But she had never asked. Because asking would have meant admitting that she cared. That the past wasn't as far away as she wanted it to be. "I don't know," she said finally. "Maybe I was afraid of what I'd find." The man nodded slowly, as if he understood. Silence stretched between them. The world around them kept moving, cars passing, people walking, life continuing as if nothing had happened. But for them, this moment felt frozen in time. Mia took a slow breath. "What happens now?" The man gave her a small, tired smile. "That's up to you," he said. Mia's fingers twitched at her sides. She had a choice now, just like she had back then. She could walk away again, pretend this never happened, let him disappear from her life a second time. Or she could ask the question that had been burning inside her since this conversation began. "What was the deal?" she asked. "The one that ruined your life." The man's smile faded. His expression darkened just slightly, like the weight of old memories was pressing down on him. "You don't want to know," he said. "Maybe not," Mia admitted. "But I think I need to." The man exhaled, then nodded. "All right," he said. "Then let's talk." Mia felt the shift in the air. The conversation had started as a fleeting interaction, a homeless man asking for $1, but now it had become something else entirely. Something heavier. Something real. She followed him a few steps until they reached a quieter corner, away from the steady flow of pedestrians. The city hummed in the background, a constant reminder that time didn't stop, even when the past came knocking. The man leaned against a cold brick wall, rubbing his hands together. "The deal wasn't supposed to ruin me," he said. "It was supposed to make me untouchable." Mia swallowed hard. "What was it?" The man exhaled, tilting his head slightly, as if debating how much to say. Then he met her gaze. "You remember the people at that party?" he asked. Mia nodded. She didn't know all their names, but she remembered their faces. Wealthy, powerful, the kind of people who could make or break lives with a single decision. "They were more than just guests," the man continued. "They were players in a game most people don't even know exists. And I was supposed to be one of them." Mia frowned. "But you weren't." The man gave a dry, humorless chuckle. "I was close," he admitted. "I was one decision away. I had the money. The connections. I had everything lined up." "Then what happened?" Mia asked. His jaw tightened. "I hesitated." She studied his face, the weight behind that single word. "You hesitated," she repeated. The man nodded. In a moment like that, hesitation is the difference between rising and falling. "I thought I was being careful. I thought I was making sure I understood the consequences. But in their world, if you're not all in, you're out." Mia felt a chill run down her spine. "So they cut you out," she murmured. The man's expression darkened. "Not just cut me out," he said. "They erased me. Everything I built, everything I was, it was gone overnight. One day I had power, a future. The next, nothing." Mia pressed her lips together. She had seen people rise and fall in the industry she was in, but never like this. Never so completely. "And you think I was part of that?" she asked. The man shook his head. "No," he said. "I think you were just another piece on the board. But I also think, if you had made a different choice that night, your life might have turned out very different too." Mia's chest tightened. She had never thought of herself as someone caught up in something bigger. She had just been there. Just another guest at a party. But now, she wasn't so sure. Mia's thoughts swirled like a storm, the weight of the man's words pressing down on her. She had spent years believing she had simply moved forward, that her choices had been her own. But now, for the first time, she wondered, had she been a pawn in something much bigger than she ever realized? She inhaled sharply, trying to clear her head. "So what do you want from me?" she asked, her voice steady despite the unease creeping up her spine. The man studied her for a moment, then shook his head. "Nothing," he said simply. "I didn't come here looking for anything. I just needed to know if I was the only one who remembered." Mia frowned. That didn't make sense. If all he wanted was to confirm that she still carried the weight of that night, why approach her now? Why not let it stay buried? "That's not the full truth," she said. The man's lips twitched, almost as if he had expected her to push. He let out a slow breath and leaned back against the brick wall. "You want the truth," he said. "All right. I wanted to see if you ever looked back. If you ever wondered what happened to the people in that room after you left." Mia felt something sink in her chest. Because the truth. She hadn't. She had walked away, convinced that whatever had happened that night, whatever deals had been made, were no longer her problem. And yet, standing here now, she realized she had been wrong. "I didn't look back," she admitted. The words felt heavy, like they carried years of unspoken guilt. "But maybe I should have." The man nodded, as if he already knew that. Mia let out a slow breath, running a hand through her hair. "So what now?" she asked. "You got your answer. Do you disappear again?" The man tilted his head slightly. "Do you want me to?" Mia hesitated. She wasn't sure how to answer. A part of her wanted to walk away, to go back to her life and pretend this conversation never happened. But another part of her, the part that had spent years ignoring the feeling that something had been left unresolved, wasn't ready to let go. She reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a second bill, this one much larger than the crumpled dollar she had given him earlier. "Take this," she said. The man looked at the money, then back at her. "That's not why I stopped you," he reminded her. "I know," she said. "But take it anyway." For a long moment, he didn't move. Then, finally, he reached out and took the bill, folding it carefully before slipping it into his pocket. "Why?" he asked. Mia met his gaze. "Because," she said, "if I'm going to start looking back, I don't want to do it alone." The man studied her, then gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. "Then I guess we have a lot to talk about," he said. Mia exhaled, feeling something shift inside her. Maybe, for the first time in years, she was finally ready to listen. The city's hum filled the space between them, a reminder that life was still moving even as they stood in the quiet shadows of the past. Mia felt the weight of the conversation settle inside her, heavier than she expected, but no longer something she wanted to ignore. The man tucked the bill into his pocket and exhaled. "You know, I didn't expect this," he admitted. "I thought you'd walk away." Mia let out a small, humorless chuckle. "So did I." He glanced at her, studying her expression. "And yet, here we are." She nodded slowly. "Here we are." 4 years, she had been running. Maybe not physically, but mentally, emotionally. She had moved forward, built a life, left that night buried in the past where she thought it belonged. But now, for the first time, she was beginning to wonder if the past wasn't something you could just leave behind. "So," the man said, shifting slightly, "what now?" Mia looked down the street, the moving blur of strangers passing by, each lost in their own lives. She had spent so long believing her story was separate from everyone else's, that her choices had only shaped her own path. But now, she wasn't so sure. She turned back to him. "You said they erased you," she said. "That you lost everything." He nodded. "Then let's get it back." The man blinked, caught off guard. "What?" Mia shrugged. "I don't know what that looks like yet. But if I was part of the moment that took it away from you, maybe I should be part of fixing it." For the first time since their conversation began, real surprise flickered across his face. "Why would you do that?" Mia thought for a moment, then said the only thing that felt true. "Because I think I need to." The man studied her, then let out a slow breath. "All right," he said. "Then let's start from the beginning." Mia nodded, feeling something shift inside her. For the first time in a long time, she wasn't just moving forward. She was finally looking back. Mia didn't know what came next. For years, she had believed that her past was sealed, locked away in decisions she could no longer change. But now, standing here with a man who had been swept away by the very same night that had shaped her, she realized something: nothing truly stays buried. The man, this stranger who wasn't really a stranger, studied her for a long moment. Then, he nodded, as if accepting something neither of them had fully spoken aloud. "This won't be easy," he said. Mia let out a breath, a small smirk playing at her lips. "Nothing worth doing ever is." He chuckled, a quiet, tired sound, but for the first time there was something lighter in his expression. As if, after all this time, a weight had finally started to lift. They didn't need to say much else. The understanding had already settled between them. Their pasts were connected, tangled in ways neither had realized until now. And maybe, just maybe, their futures would be too. The man adjusted his coat, stuffing his hands into his pockets. "So where do we start?" Mia glanced at the city around them, the people, the endless movement of life going on as if none of this had ever happened. "We find out what really happened that night," she said. He nodded again, this time with a quiet certainty. Mia took one last look at the crumpled dollar bill in his pocket, the symbol of how all of this had started. Funny, she thought. Some people believed that a single dollar didn't mean much. But tonight, it had changed everything. She turned back to the man, her voice steady. "Let's go." And with that, they walked forward, not away from the past, but straight into it. Because sometimes, the only way to move on is to go back to where it all began.